Hello, I'm Matthew. I'm an English booth interpreter and trainer of interpreters. Perhaps first of all I'd better explain what English booth means. It means I live in a sort of soundproofed cabin where I listen to other languages through my headphones and speak in English through a microphone. I grew up speaking English, my family all speaks English and not much else, and so that's sort of what the English booth is. And in international conference interpreting, that's what we would call our A language, the language that we've grown up with and that we feel most comfortable speaking. But not all interpreters are working into their mother tongue all of the time, and interpreters also sometimes work into a B language. This is a language which they're also proficient in and can communicate successfully in professionally, although it is not the language that they grew up with, and then it starts getting complicated. Spent most of the time speaking, but maybe have had some lived experience in a country of that language, in the culture. I mean, we're linguists, right? We're exposed to different languages. We do live things in different languages. Today I'd like to talk about how an interpreter starting out in their career can think about working into a second language. My first piece of advice would be don't. And I'll come back to why in a minute. When people tell me they're thinking of getting a B, I usually reply, don't get stung, because there are many, many ways in which you can be stung by a B. The first is that because you haven't had as much lived experience as in your A, you can sometimes find yourself coming up against a brick wall as an interpreter. You're talking away, explaining things, and then suddenly you think, how on earth do I say that? How do people say that in that language? This is far less likely to happen in the language that you're most comfortable with. So that's the first thing. You might be outside your comfort zone. There may be uncomfortable moments, more uncomfortable moments in your B. You may also not be fully in control. When we're speaking a language that we're comfortable in, we can be rather flexible and agile and navigate around difficult situations, keep talking fluently, and somehow end up still sounding professional and convincing and comfortable. And all of that is more of a challenge into B. Very quickly we can sound less convincing, less comfortable, and therefore less professional. And the last thing we want is for our customer to take off their headphones and say, I couldn't really understand that, or I didn't really believe what that interpreter was saying, or that interpreter has a very strong accent and that's a problem for me. We don't want to hear that. So that's why I would say don't do it. I might even go so far as to say it can't be done. Can we listen to our strongest language, our most comfortable language, where we enjoy every nuance, every single aspect of it, and then put that into another language which we don't speak as well? Can we really do that? Intellectual honesty might dictate that we can't. And yet, why am I here? Why are you watching? Why are we talking about this subject? The reason is that interpreters do not define the demand for interpretation. If you're from a country, let's say, where not many people outside your country speak your language, it's the official language of that country, but elsewhere people don't tend to learn it as a foreign language. One of your compatriots needs to address people on an international stage and wishes to do so in that language, in the language they're most comfortable with. They may have been democratically elected to represent the people and choose to represent their people, the fellow speakers of your language, in that language, so that those people can understand what their representative is saying to the world firsthand. But, of course, there are many other people around the world who will want to know what this person is saying, so there is a need for interpreters. So what do? Say to that person, no, I'm sorry, you have to do it in English or another widely spoken language because there are no foreign interpreters who understand you? Or do you try to organise a system where it is also possible for people from the country, interpreters who have that A language, who are comfortable with it, to do their best to put it into a second language so that you have multilingualism, you have communication, you have democratic representation, and you let somebody speak a language and be understood when otherwise they would not be understood. And then maybe we don't end up saying, no, you can't do it. Of course it can be done. It may not always be perfect, but then no interpretation is ever perfect. I could turn it around and say, can anyone really say that they understand a foreign language so deeply and have such sensitivity to it that they can render every nuance perfectly in their mother tongue? There may be gaps in our understanding of our passive language. There may be gaps in our expression in our active language if we have what we call a retour, another way of describing that B. So yes, we're getting stung from time to time by our B, but we're ploughing on regardless. We're giving it a good shot. We're trying to do what we can. So my second piece of advice, since this advice of not doing it doesn't seem to have worked, plan B, wait 10 years. That's what I did. I started working into my mother tongue and I already spoke reasonably fluent Spanish. I used to socialise with Spanish friends. It would never have occurred to me to interpret professionally into Spanish. But after about a decade of experience and a lot of coping skills and getting stung quite a few times from all kinds of situations and learning from those situations, I decided to give it a go. And I found that bringing all of my coping skills from the experience which I had already had was immensely helpful, because the more difficult situations you've been through, the better prepared you are for the next difficult situation. And the problem here is if you start right away working into B, you're going to be faced with a huge number of difficult situations and you haven't had them yet before. You've not been exposed to them, and you haven't been exposed to them into your A either. It takes a lot longer to be exposed to so many. So everything's going really well and you're really confident and really pleased with your performance into A. You just wait till you start trying to work into B. It's going to be even worse for you, because the difference between the two will be even more striking. The better an interpreter you are, the more you're going to suffer when you try to do it, because you'll be so aware of your limitations. You'll be so frustrated. So wait 10 years. Unfortunately, you've probably guessed there's an answer to that too, which is also about supply and demand. Worldwide, we need interpreters now for many, many languages to create that situation I was describing just now, to allow people to speak in their mother tongue when they wish to, in an international context. We need interpreters. We need the next generation of interpreters. So, what can we do about it? You have to start somewhere. And anyway, interpreting is not about achieving perfection, as I said before. So I think the first thing to remember is what I was just saying about that striking contrast between A and B. Let's stop comparing our B to our A, because it's always going to be inferior, and so what? It is by definition. That doesn't really teach us anything. What teaches us something? Compare our B to somebody else who has that language as an A. It's also going to be inferior, but it might actually teach us something, which is, here's somebody else using the same target language and using it in a richer way, with more nuances, with more resources, landing on their feet more often, with greater fluency. We can steal lots of tricks from them. We can also try to protect ourselves from the worst possible outcome. Damage limitation mode. It all sounds rather negative, but we're talking about achieving positive results. So we really don't want the customer to take off their headphones and say, I couldn't understand, or for them to say, that was very hard to listen to and tiring because of a strong accent. Those are two of the comments that unfortunately one can get when working into B. So we need to unpack those two things. What does not understanding mean? And what does having an accent mean? Let's look at the specifics. One thing is phonetic ambiguity. If what you say sounds like something which means something else, you might confuse your listener. That's important. If you have a way of speaking which shows what your background is and is perhaps different to speakers of that language, that's not necessarily important. So you need to direct your efforts. It's not a public speaking competition. You're not trying to sound like a native. That is not the aim of the exercise. The aim of the exercise is to allow clear communication to take place. And for that we need to identify specific cases of phonetic ambiguity. I had a recent case, and this is entirely in the public domain, of a Spanish politician saying that in the case of the transport proposal, we need to have a boat. Well, in the context of transport, needing to have a boat is something that an English listener will immediately have a visual image for as to what that involves. And of course, they actually meant a vote. So it's not a big deal if you say berry instead of very, and you say this is very important as a Spanish native speaker. Maybe somebody might say that's a slight Spanish accent. But if in the context of transport you start talking about boats instead of votes, that can be significant. So again, it's a silly example, but we need to be that specific to look at where confusion can occur. And the other aspect is the music. Many languages have a natural inflection or rhythm, and if we automatically transmit that into our target language, it can be very confusing. It can happen to any interpreter. When I started interpreting from Italian into English, I often used to start by saying, in Italia, we have this problem. I had no idea I was doing it. I was starting my sentence in Italian instead of in English. Instead of saying in Italy, I was saying, in Italia, we do this, we do that, right? So you can have this contamination, this rhythm that somehow gets into your head and unfortunately then comes out of your mouth as well. Echoic contamination in simultaneous interpretation because we are listening and speaking at the same time. If we look at this specifically, we can deal with it, not as a public speaking competition, not to sound like a native speaker of the target language, as I said earlier, but to look at where confusion can occur. So sometimes we want to be ultra careful to avoid the danger. Like I said, damage limitation. So here are a few strategies for a precautionary principle, a few safeguards, a few self-protection mechanisms for when you start working into a B to try to ensure that however bad it gets, the worst doesn't happen. Not to achieve perfection, just to rule out some of the worst possible outcomes and ensure we're in the broad middle ground of it being okay. So I've already mentioned phonetic ambiguity. With the music, we need to decouple. So we need to decouple our voice from the voice which we are hearing. One way to do that is systematic use of reformulation. Wherever the speaker starts, we start somewhere else. So if I say, here we are on a Thursday afternoon in Brussels, and in your language, the target language, you could say that in the same order. Instead, you could say, it's Brussels on a Thursday afternoon, and we're here to talk about this. So by starting at a different point, you take control. You dominate the discourse. You know what you want to say, and you make sure that you say it your way, even though it's a silly little thing, and even if it might have been more elegant to do it the other way in the first place. You're elegant enough, but more importantly, you're in control, because that means when things get difficult, if the speaker gets much faster, you will still be in control, having asserted control, like in a bucking bronco. Maybe Lourdes can add an image of that at the end as well, like the bee from earlier. Yeah, she's covering her head in her hands now, but we'll try and look for that. You can survive. You can stay on board, and The other technique would be strategic use of intonation. So our inflection patterns, the way we use the tone of our voice, is highly instinctive and natural in our mother tongue. It may come naturally to you to a large extent in your B language too, but it will probably need an injection, an artificial injection. Just like our immune systems and many other aspects of our body, there are all sorts of ways in which our bodies naturally protect themselves, and sometimes scientific progress can give us a little artificial boost that helps keep us healthy. And we need that artificial boost for our intonation into B. So you can look at what is new information, what is different information, what is a contrast, where am I going next in the speech, especially working into English. If you have an English Retour, which is the language I know best, then you will use your voice to give signposts and indications like this. In other languages it may be different. The crucial thing is to decouple from the source language and make sure that you are giving signposts to your listeners to show what is new, what is different. On the one hand this, but on the other hand that, and that is a different point to this. If your listener can hear that, they feel safe. They find it convincing to listen to. And we don't need to seek perfection. We don't need to do a public speaking competition because we have been phonetically clear and we've used our tone of voice to communicate clear signposts, plus we have separated ourselves from the structure by reformulating, starting in a different place. So all of those things together, hopefully, will mean that we can end up offering something to that speaker I was talking about before, who otherwise would not be able to speak in that language and be understood. So ultimately, I think if you have a B, you will get stung. But I hope that doesn't sound quite so scary now. It might not be so painful. There may be an artificial remedy that will keep you going, keep you moving. And if you keep moving, then you won't get stung twice in the same place. And that's what life's all about.